Our group will be discussing rural migration in Canada. The popular destinations for immigrants to Canada are Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal due to their diverse communities, healthcare, and economic opportunities. Immigrants coming to Canada have to decide what their priorities are and if living in a rural community or city is their best option. I'm going to discuss the pros and cons of migrating to rural Canada. First, let's talk about the cons. One of the main drawbacks of living in rural Canada is the limited resources available when compared to large urban cities. For instance, access to education, healthcare, and insurance may not be as easily accessible as it is in larger cities. Also, rural communities tend to be less diverse than urban areas, which can impact social opportunities and cultural experiences. Individuals from different ethnic or cultural backgrounds may find it challenging to integrate into a rural community where they feel there is little representation of their culture. This can lead to feelings of isolation and exclusion, which can be particularly difficult for individuals who already may feel marginalized. However, on the other hand, there are also many benefits to living in rural Canada. For example, the cost of living in rural areas is much more affordable than in large urban centers. This means that you can live comfortably and save money on expenses such as rent, groceries, and transportation. Another advantage is that there's often less competition for jobs in rural areas. This means that you may have a better chance of securing a job that suits your skills and qualifications. Additionally, rural jobs often offer higher salaries as employers may need to offer competitive wages to attract and retain workers.
I'll be talking about the rural challenges in Canada and their effects on migrants. So the first point is a decline in the significance of primary industries and manufacturing sectors. Usually this means there's a lot of social and economic restructuring and less opportunity. So when migrants come there, it's really hard for them to integrate into a community that is completely shifting the way they do things. This also means there's a lack of opportunity, which leads to underemployment and a struggle to find jobs, especially when racism is a factor, and a lot of employers in small communities will choose the people they know and the people in their communities over migrants. Another issue is a lack of resources, so there's not a lot of doctors, public transportation opportunities, or schooling, so a lot of migrants will find that when they go to small rural places, they don't find proper doctors, they can't find good transportations or even proper schools for their children, so it's really hard for them to integrate, especially when they don't know where to go to get these things. There's also a lack of settlement, so either there's very poor housing conditions or lack of housing, so it can become very hard for them to figure out where to go to get proper places to live for themselves or their family. And there's also a lack of language support services, so either there's language barriers or difficulty communicating. There's difficulty for them to find people that can translate for them, and so day-to-day communication becomes very difficult, and it's very hard for them to learn English when they can't figure out where to go. They don't have these resources, and so it's hard for them in every way to integrate themselves into society when they can't even communicate. And then there's also a lot of racism and discrimination. So within small knit communities, they're very small and exclusive compared to larger urban areas. So there's less diversity, which means that there's more room for racism and discrimination because those communities are very tight-knit. They don't really want outsiders in there. This can lead to isolation for migrants who may feel like they don't belong, or that they're not really part of a community and they're isolated from everyone, and this can make it very hard for them to integrate and feel like they belong in Canada.
So the Canadian government has recently put into place policy to address the issues in attracting and retaining skilled workers and professionals in rural communities and northern cities. So the Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot, or RNIP, offers a community need-driven pathway for immigration. This works similarly to the private sponsorship for refugees that we looked at for class, but again, this is for migrants and not refugee status migrants. So each participating community, they're up on the slide here, has a website in which prospective migrants can find positions tailored to their positions and credentials. Then you can apply to be recommended by the community through this MNP, the Municipal Nomination Program. And so this kind of creates a better fit for communities and migrants between the two. And central to this is that the migrants express the intention of staying in a rural community. So it's really trying to get at this issue of retention. But there's a few issues with this. It fulfills this rational need for labor, so it leans on these, the needs of economic needs of our Canadian communities. So it's part of this larger immigration story, obviously. But aside from some benefits like we have this alternative and maybe easier route to immigration. It does pose a few problems. It doesn't combat issues that have been outlined above, discrimination, lack of family opportunities, lack of organizations, and is in a sense just sticking immigrants in positions that are already seen as undesirable to Canadians because nobody's staying there. It does, however, allow for communication between migrant and community, can facilitate this migration process. It also can let people know what they're getting into as far as rural Canada, so there is a reciprocity between migrant and community there, but again, it does not address these on-the-ground difficulties that happen upon arrival.
Now we will look at the local population and ask what effect this immigration has had on the communities living there before. The positive and negative effects depend on a number of factors, such as the size of the community living there before, the traditions, the economic and social opportunities in the area, and the culture of the newcomers, as some might be Canadians and others foreigners. The impact can be positive with economic growth due to investments, because people moving to rural areas are usually wealthier. It also brings new cultural diversity and creates an opening to the world. However, has many local population believes, and as one of the First Nation representatives explained to Parliament and also in an open letter, many local communities have a negative view on rural migration. They fear a drain on resources, especially forest, sea, and also the ground with oil, a destruction of the environment due to an increase in population, an increase in the cost of living, and also social tension related to the different communities and the different cultures opposing each other. This has been particularly the case in two areas in Canada, so Alberta with an old rush in the 80s and still now, and also in Quebec where French Canadian felt threatened after the 60s due to rural migration.
Alright, so now we're going to be taking a look at a success story of a professional that migrated to a smaller, more rural area in Canada. So this is Edward David, and he's a graduate of the Canadian Immigrant Integration Program, or the CIIP. He came from New Delhi, India, and now lives in Kitmut, BC, where he found a job as a health service administrator at a nearby hospital, and his wife also found a job at a nearby hospital. Edward stated that originally when he came to the CIIP program, he assumed that they would move to a larger metropolitan area. When the opportunity presented itself, they chose a smaller town. I took a few quotes from the interview that provided some more anecdotal insight of migrating to rural areas. The first quote states that opposed to what most think, these rural areas have a lot of job opportunities that are not taken advantage of. This provides evidence against one of the larger deterrents of professionals moving to these rural areas, fearing that there are too few opportunities when in reality there are indeed opportunities that are available for these professionals when you look in the right places. In the second quote, Edward states how small towns in Canada have the same standards of facility as large towns, which he compares to India, stating that in India, the smaller towns did not have the capital to have the same level of facilities as the larger cities. This may serve as a reason that people migrating to Canada tend to move to larger cities because of the perception of better facilities and better job opportunities. That was the reality of the countries that they came from. In the last quote, Edward talks about the closeness of the people in rural communities, saying that you know everybody in the community by name, which in turn provides an environment that is welcoming and better for raising kids, building a family, and establishing a home. This is one of the many reasons why moving to rural communities is beneficial for these professionals and their families.
Although big cities in Canada remain the top destinations for immigrants, our presentation has aimed to demonstrate the potential advantages of settling in rural communities. By discussing the policies and impact of immigration on local residents, as well as highlighting a success story, we hope to encourage future generations of immigrants to consider rural Canada as a welcome and fulfilling place to call home. If you have any questions, please let us know.